What are dynamics in music? Take a look at this sheet music for a few seconds. Maybe you've learned to read sheet music and know what all this means. If not, though, most of this probably looks like an alien language. There are a couple of symbols on here that even the untrained eye should recognize, those being the English letters seen here and here. While these letters do not form words, they do communicate something to those who read sheet music. But what do they mean? In this video, we will be covering their meaning, as well as the meaning, terms, and symbols of the most widely used dynamics in music. In Greece, during the 1st century, there lived a priest and philosopher named Plutarch. Some of his writings survive today. Among them is a collection of essays and observations he made about Greek and Roman life in the 1st century called Moralia. In these writings, he gives us an insight into the music of his time, and of interest is how he describes there being shifts in dynamics. What do I mean by dynamics? Musically speaking, when we use the term dynamics, we are referring to how loud music is performed. So Plutarch was referring to how the music of his time had changes in how loud or soft it was. Let us examine how this is communicated in music by the terms and symbols used for dynamics. We shall begin by looking at the basic degrees of loudness and softness in music, starting with the general term for loud in music, forte. Forte, written as a lowercase fancy f in sheet music, is an Italian word that means strong. It means the music should be played loud. But what if the music should be played soft? That is when we use the Italian word piano, notated as a fancy little p in sheet music. Now you might be wondering why this instrument is called a piano when I just told you piano means soft in Italian. That is because the piano's full name is pianoforte, which you should now know means soft loud. The piano was basically the first keyboard instrument that could produce varying dynamics based on how forcefully each key is played. Before the pianoforte, nearly all keyboard instruments lacked the ability to produce varying degrees of loud and soft dynamics, especially for each individual key on the keyboard. But what if you want music to be played somewhere between soft and loud? Well, there are two options there, but first let me introduce you to the Italian word mezzo. It means half, middle, or medium in Italian, and it is used in many musical terms, such as mezzo-soprano, which is someone whose vocal range falls between a soprano and an alto, a sort of half-soprano, if you will, although some mezzo-sopranos will likely take offense at being called such. Back to dynamics. We use the word mezzo in conjunction with forte and piano to indicate degrees of loudness and softness between them. So if you want the music to be somewhat loud, but not as loud as forte, then you would indicate it as mezzo forte. If you want the music to be somewhat soft, a little louder than piano, but not quite a mezzo forte, then you would indicate it as mezzo piano. Keep in mind that these terms are all very relative and subjective. By that, I mean the composer's idea of how loud forte is may differ from the performer who is interpreting the music the composer wrote. Professional musicians and conductors often have very different views on how a piece of music's dynamics should be portrayed. This is especially the case when the performer is using modern instruments and performing styles when interpreting music composed 200 or more years ago. But I digress. What if a composer wants a section of his or her music to be played very loud? I will answer that, but first a little grammar lesson on the Italian language. In Italian, there is a form of an adjective called an absolute superlative, which is just a fancy way of saying a word used to describe something in a positive way in the highest capacity. For instance, if you saw an extraordinarily beautiful woman and wanted to communicate that she is the most beautiful woman who has ever lived, you would not just describe her as bella, the Italian word for beautiful, but bellissimo, which is the absolute superlative. So in music, when we describe music as very loud, the absolute superlative of forte is used, which is fortissimo. The same goes for when the music should be very soft. Instead of piano, pianissimo is used. You might be wondering why so much Italian is used in dynamics as well as other musical terms. To put it simply, the majority of the most important and influential composers of the Renaissance and Baroque were either Italians or trained in Italy or by Italians. I plan on making a video that explains this more in depth, but to keep this focus on dynamics, that brief answer will have to suffice. For about 200 years, the basic dynamic terms and symbols we have covered so far were used. But as the 18th century came to a close, there started appearing the use of more extreme dynamic markings, such as 3 Fs, which I guess would be fortissimo. One of the first composers to use such extreme dynamic markings was Beethoven. For instance, he used 3 Fs in his Lenore Overture No. 2, as well as his 7th Symphony. 3 Fs may seem pointless, as fortissimo is supposed to be the superlative, i.e. the absolute loudest a section of music could be played. Of course, Beethoven is implying with the use of 3 Fs that the music should relatively be louder than fortissimo, perhaps more forcibly and aggressive too. Again, there is a lot of room for interpretation here, and one could likely discuss Beethoven's meaning of 3 Fs for hours on end. The important point I wish to make here, though, is that composers began using even more extremes than just fortissimo and pianissimo during the 19th century. And things even seemed to get out of hand going into the 1800s with these extreme dynamic markings, such as Tchaikovsky's use of 6 Ps in a bassoon solo from his 6th Symphony, the first movement. Other composers have clustered together even more than 6 Ps and Fs, but the vast majority of musical works, especially those outside of large orchestral ones, use pianissimo as the softest and fortissimo as the loudest. Some works have a very narrow range of dynamics, staying mostly quiet or mostly loud, while others have extreme ranges, such as Gustav Mahler's 5th Symphony. What if a composer wants a piece of music to gradually move from soft becoming louder as it progresses? Well, there are musical terms and symbols to cover gradual changes in dynamics too. The two main ones both use the Italian word crescendo, which means to grow. Crescendo in music means to gradually grow louder, and decrescendo means to gradually grow softer, as the prefix de in Italian, in this case, means to negate something. Sometimes other terms are used for decrescendo, such as diminuendo, which means to decrease in Italian. Other terms are used, but so seldom we need not concern ourselves with them for the purpose of this video. How these gradual changes are notated in music depends on the context, as shorter ones are generally notated using hairpins, or symbols that resemble the greater than and less than indicators used in mathematics. For longer gradual changes, crescendo or decrescendo abbreviations can be used, sometimes in conjunction with dashes to indicate how long they should occur. Italian words such as molto, meaning much, poco, meaning a little, or even poco a poco, meaning little by little, can be used together with these gradual change terms to modify them. For instance, in Beethoven's 7th Symphony, second movement, he indicates crescendo poco a poco to indicate a very gradual increase in how loud the orchestra is playing that section. Another group of dynamic terms in music involves using a dynamic accent, and this is usually indicated by placing this symbol above or beneath a note. There are other types of accents in music notation, but not all deal with dynamics. For the rest of this video, when I mention an accent, it will be a dynamic accent. This accent seen here generally means a particular note should stand out by being played louder than the others. An example of this can be found in the first movement of Mozart's Facili Sonata. Notice how the accents are there to help the melody notes project, as well as shape the contour of the melody. There are also a few different ways to indicate other types of accents that affect dynamics, such as something called sforzando and its many variations. But to keep this video simple, we will just mention the sforzando. A sforzando, indicated by an SFZ written on a note or chord, indicates a sudden emphasis of forte. It is virtually similar to a dynamic accent, but depending on who you ask, it can affect the duration of the note as well. There is some confusion surrounding the exact way to interpret some of the variations of the sforzando, but for the scope of most music appreciation students and those wanting to know more about music, know that a sforzando means a sudden, strong accent on a note. Of course, we must address that when studying the history of Western music, one must realize that it is only relatively recently that most instruments have had the technological improvements to them which allow them much greater control over the dynamics they can produce. Even the human voice is quite limited in its dynamic range for even professional singers, although using proper breath control and projection techniques can allow a person to be heard over an entire orchestra. This is why opera singers sound so differently from most pop singers today, as electronic amplification is rarely used in opera. During the 1800s, musical ensembles, especially the orchestra, began to increase dramatically in size, allowing for much louder dynamics. And again, the technological improvements of these instruments allowed musicians much greater control over the instrument's dynamic range. Even the piano saw huge improvements, such as a cast iron frame, extended range, longer strings made of steel allowed it to produce a greater range of dynamics. So when listening to older music, we must have realistic expectations of how dynamics are utilized. Of course, some music publishers and musicians take liberties when interpreting the music of Bach, Haydn, and Mozart, but during the past few decades there has been a greater effort dedicated to performing music authentically, including the dynamics to be accurate to each work. Modern popular music rarely features the dynamic shifts and subtleties we find in most classical works due to the nature and function of most popular music. But some songs do have varying dynamics. The beginning of Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin features a very soft guitar solo by Jimmy Page, accompanied by mellotron flutes. The song itself builds, adding more instruments, as Robert Plant's vocals become louder. About 6 minutes into the song, the dynamic level is definitely more forte than the piano at the song's beginning section. Most popular music, though, is too short and not designed for much in the way of dynamic shifts, and therefore people rarely pay attention to such changes unless they hit them over the head, such as the surprise Haydn put in the second movement of his Surprise Symphony. This piece will be one of the suggested listening examples at the end of this video, as well as in the video's description. Being an exemplary listener and appreciating music more means we should pay closer attention to changes in dynamics, asking ourselves what the composer was trying to express by having the music play soft, loud, or gradual changes of such. When you hear a piece of music performed very loud, what effect does it have? Maybe it makes the music more intense, scarier, or overflowing with joy. Alternatively, what effect does it have on music when softer dynamics are used? Maybe it makes you listen more carefully. Does it evoke an air of reverence? Does it convey gentleness, or maybe sorrow? What follows are a few pieces of music to use as examples of how dynamics can be used in music to create greater expression of mood, emotion, and ideas. While listening to them, see if you can identify sections you think are played piano, forte, with crescendo, or any of the other terms we covered. Just remember what I said earlier about how these terms are relative and subjective. If you check the sheet music and find the composer wrote mezzo forte when you guess piano, it doesn't necessarily mean you were incorrect. The point is not so much to guess such things accurately, but to be more aware of these dynamic terms and identify how dynamics affect a piece of music. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like this video and subscribe if you found this helpful. Check out my other content on this channel as well, and I will leave you with that promised list of examples.